The humiliation was complete. Professor Jennifer Blackwood stood at the front of her economics classroom, holding up a paper marked with a red D- for everyone to see. The 20-year-old Bulgarian immigrant student had just presented months of research on helping low-income families invest spare change through a mobile app. But Blackwood wasn't just critiquing his business model. She was attacking everything about him. "This is naive immigrant thinking," she declared, her voice dripping with condescension. "Perhaps if you had a better grasp of American economic realities rather than whatever socialist concepts you learned elsewhere, you would understand why this will never work." Mark Petrov felt his face burn with shame as 23 classmates watched his dreams get crushed in real time. The professor suggested he reconsider his major, maybe find something more suitable for someone with his background and limited understanding of American business culture. What Professor Blackwood didn't know was that her brutal dismissal would ignite something dangerous in Mark. Her public humiliation would become the fuel for the most spectacular revenge in academic history. Within months, the same business idea she had mocked would attract the attention of billionaire investors. The immigrant student she had dismissed would prove her wrong in ways that would cost her everything. The quiet kid from Bulgaria was about to show his arrogant professor exactly how much he understood about American business. And when the dust settled, Jennifer Blackwood would discover that dismissing the wrong student can destroy more than just dreams. Sometimes it destroys careers. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in classroom 304 of Riverside University's prestigious business building. 23 students sat in uncomfortable plastic chairs, laptops open, waiting for what everyone knew would be another brutal presentation session in Professor Jennifer Blackwood's advanced economics course. The woman had a reputation that preceded her like a storm cloud. In her 15 years at Riverside, she had crushed more dreams than a demolition crew, and today promised to be no different. Mark Petrov sat in the third row, his worn backpack stuffed with papers that represented months of research. His presentation was scheduled for today, and his stomach churned with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The 20-year-old had spent countless nights in the library, surviving on energy drinks and determination, crafting what he believed was groundbreaking research on micro-investment applications for low-income communities. Professor Blackwood entered the room like she owned it, which in many ways she did. At 52, Jennifer Blackwood was a formidable woman with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and reading glasses that seemed permanently perched on the end of her nose for the sole purpose of looking down at people. She wore a charcoal business suit that probably cost more than most students spent on textbooks in a semester. Her heels clicked against the linoleum floor with military precision as she made her way to the front of the class. Behind her wire-rimmed glasses, her cold blue eyes surveyed the room like a general inspecting troops she expected to find wanting. She had built her career on being the professor that separated the wheat from the chaff, the one who told students hard truths about the real world of business. In her mind, she was doing them a favor by crushing their unrealistic dreams early, before the real world did it for them. "Good morning," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate attention. "Today we continue our final presentations on entrepreneurial business models. I trust you have all prepared adequately, though if history is any indication, most of you have not." A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was Professor Blackwood's standard opening, designed to put everyone on edge before the presentations even began. She placed her leather briefcase on the desk with a deliberate thud and pulled out a stack of evaluation forms. "Mr. Petrov," she called out without looking up from her papers, "you're first today. Please come forward and enlighten us with your business proposal." Mark's heart rate spiked immediately. He had hoped to present later in the class, giving himself time to observe the professor's mood and adjust accordingly. No such luck. He gathered his materials, including a small stack of printed charts and graphs that had cost him nearly $30 to produce at the campus print shop, money he could barely afford. As he walked to the front of the classroom, Mark caught the eye of his friend Jake Thompson, who gave him an encouraging nod. Jake was one of the few students in the class who had shown genuine interest in Mark's research, often staying after their study sessions to discuss the potential applications of micro-investment technology for underserved communities. Mark connected his laptop to the projection system, his hands trembling slightly as he fumbled with the cable. The first slide appeared on the screen, micro-investment applications for low-income communities, bridging the wealth gap through technology. He cleared his throat and began. Professor Blackwood, fellow students, today I want to present a business model that addresses one of the most persistent challenges in American economic development. The wealth gap between different socioeconomic classes continues to widen, and traditional investment opportunities remain largely inaccessible to low-income families. Professor Blackwood had already begun taking notes, though her expression suggested she was documenting problems rather than merits. Mark pressed forward, clicking to his second slide, which showed statistics about investment accessibility. My research indicates that 73% of American families earning less than $40,000 annually have never invested in any financial instrument beyond a basic savings account. This isn't due to lack of interest, but rather lack of access and education. Traditional investment platforms require minimum deposits that are often prohibitive for families living paycheck to paycheck. He clicked to the next slide, revealing his proposed solution. My business model centers around a mobile application that would allow users to invest spare change from everyday purchases into diversified portfolios. For example, if someone buys coffee for $3.50, the application would round up to $4 and invest the 50 cents difference. Professor Blackwood's pen had stopped moving, and she was now staring at Mark with an expression that made his confidence waver. Several students were leaning forward, genuinely interested in the concept, but the professor's reaction was what mattered for his grade. The application would also include educational components. Mark continued, his voice gaining strength as he discussed the features he had spent months researching. Users would receive bite-sized financial literacy lessons, explaining basic investment concepts in accessible language. The goal is to demystify investing and make it approachable for people who have been historically excluded from wealth-building opportunities. He presented data showing the potential market size, revenue projections based on small transaction fees, and case studies from similar applications in other countries. His research was thorough, incorporating economic theory they had studied throughout the semester and demonstrating real-world applications. The social impact potential is significant, Mark explained, warming to his subject. If we can help low-income families build even modest investment portfolios over time, we begin to address systemic wealth inequality at its roots. This isn't charity or a handout. It's providing access to the same wealth-building tools that middle and upper-class families take for granted. When he finished his presentation, Mark felt cautiously optimistic. His research was solid, his business model was well-reasoned, and several students were nodding approvingly. He had addressed potential challenges, provided realistic financial projections, and demonstrated a clear understanding of the economic principles they had studied. Professor Blackwood removed her glasses and cleaned them slowly, a gesture that had become legendary among students as a precursor to academic destruction. She placed them back on her nose and stood up, walking around her desk to face Mark directly. "Mr. Petrov," she began, her voice dripping with condescension. "This presentation represents exactly the kind of naive thinking that keeps people trapped in poverty rather than helping them escape it." Mark felt his stomach drop. Around the classroom, students who had been engaged moments before now looked away, uncomfortable with the professor's tone but unwilling to challenge her authority. "Your fundamental premise is flawed," Professor Blackwood continued, beginning to pace in front of the whiteboard like a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. "You assume that the primary barrier to wealth building among low-income families is access to investment platforms. This demonstrates a profound misunderstanding of basic economic realities." She turned to face the class, using Mark's presentation as a teaching moment and failure. "The reason low-income families don't invest isn't because they lack access to apps or because investment minimums are too high. It's because they lack disposable income. When you're choosing between paying rent and buying groceries, you don't have spare change to round up from coffee purchases." Several students were now taking notes, treating the professor's critique as course material. Mark stood frozen at the front of the room, watching his months of work being dismantled piece by piece. Furthermore, Professor Blackwood continued, her voice growing sharper. "This application would actually harm the very people it claims to help. Low-income families need every penny they earn for immediate necessities. Automatically investing their spare change would reduce their already limited liquidity, potentially preventing them from covering emergency expenses. She walked closer to Mark, her presence intimidating as she delivered what felt like a personal attack disguised as academic feedback. This is the kind of superficial thinking that comes from misunderstanding the communities you claim to want to help. Perhaps if you had a better grasp of American economic realities rather than whatever socialist concepts you might have learned elsewhere, you would understand why this business model is fundamentally unviable. The classroom fell dead silent. The comment about socialist concepts and learning elsewhere was a clear reference to Mark's immigrant background, something that had never been directly addressed in class before, but had always seemed to hover beneath the surface of Professor Blackwood's interactions with him. Mark's face burned with embarrassment and anger. His accent, which he had worked hard to minimize, suddenly felt more pronounced. His hands, still holding his presentation materials, began to shake with emotion. Your market research is also questionable, Professor Blackwood continued, apparently unaware of or unconcerned with the impact of her previous comment. You cite success stories from other countries without acknowledging fundamental differences in economic structures, government support systems, and cultural attitudes toward investing. What works in Scandinavia or South Korea cannot simply be transplanted to American markets. She returned to her desk and made several marks on her evaluation form, the sound of her pen scratching across paper audible in the silent classroom. The educational component you've proposed also reveals a concerning assumption that low-income families simply need to be taught how to manage money better. This is both condescending and ignorant of the systemic barriers that create and maintain wealth inequality. Mark wanted to respond, to defend his research and explain the nuances she was ignoring, but the professor's aggressive questioning style and personal attacks had left him speechless. He had anticipated academic criticism, but not this level of personal dismissal. Class, Professor Blackwood announced, turning away from Mark to address the other students. This presentation serves as an excellent example of how good intentions can mask poor business thinking. In the real world, investors and customers don't care about your desire to help people. They care about viable business models, sustainable revenue streams, and realistic market assessments. She held up Mark's evaluation form so the class could see the grade written in red ink at the top, D-. Mr. Petrov, this grade reflects not only the fundamental flaws in your business concept, but also your failure to demonstrate the kind of rigorous analytical thinking required for success in American business environments. I suggest you reconsider whether this field is appropriate for your skill set and background. The final comment hung in the air like a physical blow. Around the classroom, students looked uncomfortable but remained silent. Some stared at their laptops, others doodled in notebooks, but no one met Mark's eyes as he slowly gathered his materials. Jake Thompson, sitting in the second row, looked visibly angry but knew that challenging Professor Blackwood would likely result in retaliation against his own academic standing. The professor had a reputation for remembering students who questioned her authority, and those students rarely received favorable treatment in future assignments. As Mark walked back to his seat, Professor Blackwood was already calling the next presenter. Ms. Rodriguez, please come forward with your presentation on luxury retail market expansion. Mark slumped into his chair, his carefully researched presentation materials feeling worthless in his hands. Months of work, dozens of late nights in the library, and genuine passion for helping underserved communities had been dismissed in less than 10 minutes. Worse than the academic criticism was the underlying message about his background, his accent, and his place in American academia. The rest of the class period passed in a blur. Mark heard other presentations being discussed, some receiving praise, others constructive criticism, but none receiving the level of personal attack that had been directed at him. When class finally ended, students began packing up their belongings and filing out of the room. Professor Blackwood remained at her desk, organizing her papers with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. As Mark passed her desk on his way out, she looked up briefly. "Mr. Petrov," she called out, her voice now adopting a tone of fake concern. "I hope you understand that my critique was intended to help you. The business world can be quite unforgiving to unrealistic ideas. Better to learn these lessons here than in a real boardroom." Mark paused at the doorway, his backpack heavy on his shoulders. For a moment, he considered responding, defending his research, or at least acknowledging her feedback. Instead, he simply nodded and walked out of the classroom. In the hallway, Jake caught up with him. "Mark, man, that was completely out of line. The way she talked about your background, that wasn't academic criticism. That was just mean." Mark shook his head, still processing what had happened. Maybe she's right. Maybe I don't understand American business well enough to propose solutions for American problems. "That's bullshit and you know it," Jake replied firmly. "Your research was solid. I've seen the data you collected. You spent more time on that presentation than anyone else in the class spent on theirs." They walked toward the campus center, passing groups of students heading to their next classes or grabbing lunch between academic obligations. The normal rhythm of university life continued around them, indifferent to Mark's academic humiliation. "You know what the worst part is?" Mark said as they sat down on a bench outside the business building. "I actually believed in that idea. I thought it could make a real difference for families like mine, families who work hard but never seem to get ahead financially." Jake nodded, understanding the personal dimension of Mark's disappointment. He knew that Mark's family had struggled financially since immigrating to the United States, and that Mark worked part-time at a local grocery store to help support them while maintaining his full-time course load. "Just because one professor shot it down doesn't mean the idea is worthless," Jake offered. "Blackwood has been here forever. She's probably never had to worry about money a day in her life. What does she know about the problems you're trying to solve?" Mark appreciated his friend's support, but the sting of public humiliation was still fresh. The grade itself was devastating enough, but the personal comments about his background and his understanding of American business culture cut deeper than any academic criticism. As they sat on the bench, Mark made a decision that would change everything. The humiliation he had experienced in that classroom, the dismissive comments about his immigrant background, and the casual destruction of months of work had ignited something inside him. Professor Blackwood had intended to crush his confidence and redirect his academic focus. Instead, she had accidentally provided him with the motivation he needed to prove her completely wrong. "You know what, Jake?" Mark said, his voice carrying a new determination. "Maybe I will reconsider my approach, but not the way she thinks." Jake looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" Mark stood up, shouldering his backpack with renewed purpose. "I mean, maybe it's time to stop asking for permission and start building something real." The humiliation in Professor Blackwood's classroom had been 3 months ago, but Mark Petrov could still feel the sting of her words every morning when he woke up at 5 a.m. to begin another 18-hour day. The cramped studio apartment he shared with his younger sister Elena had become his headquarters, his sanctuary, and his prison all at once. Every surface was covered with printouts, sticky notes, legal documents, and empty energy drink cans that served as monuments to his relentless work schedule. Mark had made a decision that day walking out of classroom 304. If Professor Blackwood wanted to dismiss his idea as unrealistic immigrant thinking, he would show her exactly how unrealistic his thinking could be. But he wouldn't do it through another presentation or academic paper. He would do it by building the application himself and proving that everything she had said was not only wrong, but spectacularly, humiliatingly wrong. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. The first weeks after the presentation had been dark ones. Mark had questioned everything about himself, his abilities, and his place in American academia. He had considered switching majors, maybe pursuing something safer, something that wouldn't invite the kind of personal attacks he had experienced in Blackwood's class. But every time he walked through the low-income neighborhood where his family lived, every time he saw his mother counting and recounting the bills on their kitchen table, every time he witnessed families making impossible choices between basic necessities, his resolve strengthened. Professor Blackwood had been wrong about almost everything, but she had been spectacularly wrong about one thing in particular. Mark did understand the communities he wanted to help because he lived in one of them. The first breakthrough had come during a conversation with Diego Santos, a 30-year-old entrepreneur who ran a small tech consulting business out of a shared workspace downtown. Mark had met Diego through a campus networking event, and unlike most of the other professionals there, Diego had actually listened when Mark described his micro-investment application idea. "You know what your problem is?" Diego had said over coffee at a late-night diner frequented by freelancers and night shift workers. "You're trying to convince people who have never been broke that you understand what broke people need. Stop asking for permission and start building solutions." Diego had offered something invaluable: mentorship without condescension. He had immigrated to the United States from Mexico 15 years earlier with a computer science degree and $50 in his pocket. He understood the particular challenges that came with being an immigrant entrepreneur, the constant need to prove worthiness in spaces that felt perpetually foreign. The beautiful thing about code, Diego had explained during one of their late-night planning sessions, is that it doesn't care about your accent or where you're from. If it works, it works. If it solves problems, people will use it. Everything else is just noise. Under Diego's guidance, Mark had begun learning mobile application development with the intensity of someone whose life depended on it. He spent his mornings attending classes, fulfilling the academic requirements that would allow him to graduate and keep his student visa status current. His afternoons were devoted to his part-time job stocking shelves and running cash registers at Martinez Family Grocery, a small supermarket that served the predominantly immigrant community where he lived. But it was during the nights that Mark truly came alive. From 8 p.m. until 2 or 3 in the morning, he immersed himself in programming tutorials, user interface design principles, financial regulation compliance, and market research. His sister Elena had grown accustomed to falling asleep to the sound of his fingers flying across the keyboard and waking up to find him exactly where she had left him, surrounded by the detritus of another marathon coding session. The application he was building was far more sophisticated than anything he had outlined in his original presentation to Professor Blackwood. What had started as a simple spare change investment tool had evolved into a comprehensive financial empowerment platform specifically designed for low-income families and immigrant communities. The core functionality remained the same. Users could link their debit cards and checking accounts to the application, which would round up everyday purchases to the nearest dollar and invest the difference in diversified, low-cost index funds. But Mark had added features that addressed the specific concerns Professor Blackwood had raised about liquidity and emergency access. Users could set personalized emergency fund targets before any money was invested. The application would help them build emergency savings first, only beginning investment contributions once they had achieved their safety net goals. They could also pause or modify their investment contributions at any time and access their invested funds within 24 hours if needed. More importantly, Mark had developed educational components that went far beyond basic financial literacy. The application included modules on understanding credit reports, navigating the immigration system's financial requirements, building business credit, and accessing small business loans. It was designed by someone who understood the specific financial challenges faced by immigrant families, because it was designed by someone who lived those challenges every day. The market research phase had been particularly satisfying. Mark had spent weeks conducting surveys in his own neighborhood, talking to families at community centers, and gathering data from immigrant-serving nonprofit organizations. Unlike the theoretical market analysis he had presented in Professor Blackwood's class, this research was grounded in real conversations with real people facing real financial challenges. What he discovered validated everything he had argued in his original presentation and more. 78% of the families he surveyed expressed strong interest in investment opportunities that required minimal initial capital. 82% said they would be willing to pay small fees for financial education that was provided in their native language and designed for their specific circumstances. Most importantly, 69% of respondents said they regularly had small amounts of money that they would be willing to invest if the process was simple, transparent, and designed for people with limited financial experience. Professor Blackwood's assertion that low-income families had no disposable income had been not just wrong, but insultingly wrong. The technical development had been the most challenging aspect of the project. Mark had been forced to learn not just programming languages and development frameworks, but also the complex regulatory requirements surrounding financial services applications. He had spent countless hours studying SEC regulations, state banking laws, and federal consumer protection statutes. Diego had been instrumental during this phase, connecting Mark with other entrepreneurs who had navigated similar regulatory challenges. Through these connections, Mark had learned about regulatory sandboxes, pilot program opportunities, and the specific legal structures required for fintech startups. By the end of his second month of development, Mark had a working prototype that could handle user registration, account linking, transaction monitoring, and basic investment functionality. He had also established relationships with a custodial broker that could handle the actual investment transactions and a compliance consultant who could help ensure the application met all regulatory requirements. The breakthrough moment had come during a beta test with 25 families from his neighborhood. Mark had spent 2 weeks walking them through the application, explaining how it worked, and gathering feedback on the user experience. The results had exceeded his most optimistic projections. Over the course of just 2 weeks, these 25 families had invested a total of $437 in accumulated spare change. More importantly, 18 of them had completed at least 3 educational modules, and 12 had used the application's credit monitoring features to identify and address errors on their credit reports. Maria Gonzalez, a single mother who worked 2 part-time jobs while raising 3 children, had been particularly enthusiastic. "This is exactly what I needed," she had told Mark during a follow-up interview. "I always wanted to save money for my kids' future, but I never knew how to start. This makes it so simple that I don't even have to think about it." The feedback had been overwhelmingly positive, but more importantly, it had provided Mark with the data he needed to prove his business model was not only viable, but actively beneficial for the communities it was designed to serve. Users were engaging with the educational content, building emergency funds, and beginning to develop positive investment habits. Armed with this data, Mark had begun the process of seeking seed funding for broader development and launch. This was where his lack of traditional business connections became a significant obstacle. Unlike his classmates who had family members in finance or business networks built through internships at major corporations, Mark was navigating the investment world as a complete outsider. His first dozen pitches to angel investors and venture capital firms had been educational disasters. Mark had quickly learned that his academic presentation style, which had been perfectly appropriate for Professor Blackwood's classroom, was completely inadequate for convincing investors to provide funding for a real business venture. The feedback had been consistent and frustrating. Investors liked the concept and were impressed by his early user data, but they questioned his ability to scale the business without more experienced leadership. Several had suggested he consider bringing on a more traditional CEO while remaining involved as a technical founder. This feedback had been particularly painful because it echoed some of the same themes from Professor Blackwood's critique. The implication was clear: his idea might have merit, but he personally was not the right person to execute it successfully. Once again, he was being told that his background and experience were liabilities rather than assets. The turning point had come through an unexpected connection. Elena, Mark's sister, worked part-time as a tutor for elementary school students while attending community college. One of her students was the daughter of Rebecca Chun, a marketing executive at a mid-sized tech company who had previously worked at several successful startups. Rebecca had heard about Mark's application through Elena and had asked to see a demonstration. Unlike the venture capital investors Mark had been pitching, Rebecca immediately understood both the technical sophistication of the application and the market opportunity it represented. "You're thinking about this all wrong," Rebecca had told him during their first meeting. "You don't need traditional venture capital funding to launch this. What you need is strategic partnerships with organizations that already serve your target market." Rebecca had introduced Mark to a network of community development financial institutions, immigrant-serving nonprofits, and credit unions that were actively looking for innovative ways to serve their members. These organizations were less concerned with Mark's pedigree or traditional business experience and more interested in solutions that could genuinely help their communities. Through these partnerships, Mark had been able to secure the funding and support structure needed to launch his application more broadly. Rather than seeking millions of dollars from venture capital firms, he had assembled a network of smaller investments and grants from organizations that understood and supported his mission. The official launch had been planned for a Tuesday morning in late February, exactly 6 months after Professor Blackwood had dismissed his idea as unrealistic immigrant thinking. Mark had spent the previous week conducting final testing, coordinating with his partner organizations, and preparing for what he hoped would be a successful but modest launch. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The application had been featured in a newsletter sent by the National Association of Community Development Financial Institutions to their membership network. This newsletter was forwarded to various immigrant rights organizations, financial literacy nonprofits, and community development corporations across the country. Within 48 hours of launch, Mark had over 3,000 user registrations. Within a week, that number had grown to 15,000. The application wasn't just being used by individuals, but was being recommended by financial counselors, social workers, and community organizers as a legitimate tool for building financial stability. More importantly, the user engagement data was unprecedented. 73% of users were actively using the spare change investment feature. 68% had completed at least 5 educational modules. 41% had used the application's tools to improve their credit scores. The media attention had started small, with coverage in community newspapers and nonprofit organization blogs. But as the user numbers continued to grow and the impact data became more impressive, larger publications began to take notice. A feature article in the business section of the city's major newspaper had led to coverage in national personal finance publications. The story of a college student who had built a successful fintech application after his professor told him his idea was unrealistic had proven irresistible to journalists looking for inspiring entrepreneurship stories. But the real validation had come from an unexpected source. Robert Sterling, the billionaire founder and CEO of Sterling Industries, had seen the media coverage and had asked his team to investigate the application further. Sterling Industries was one of the largest investment management firms in the country, with over $200 billion in assets under management. What made Sterling's interest particularly significant was his own background. Born in South Africa, Robert Sterling had immigrated to the United States in his 20s with an engineering degree and ambitious plans to build technology companies. His first startup had been dismissed by American investors as unrealistic, and he had been forced to bootstrap his early ventures through personal savings and small business loans. Sterling had built his empire by identifying innovative technologies and business models that established industry players had overlooked or dismissed. His investment philosophy was based on finding entrepreneurs who were solving real problems for underserved markets, particularly in areas where traditional financial institutions had failed to innovate. When Sterling's team presented their analysis of Mark's application, he had been immediately interested. The combination of solid technical execution, impressive user engagement data, and a clear social impact mission aligned perfectly with Sterling Industries' investment criteria. More importantly, Sterling had recognized something in Mark's story that resonated with his own experience as an immigrant entrepreneur. The dismissal by academic experts, the struggle to be taken seriously by traditional funding sources, and the determination to prove critics wrong were all elements of his own entrepreneurial journey. The call had come on a Thursday afternoon in early March. Mark had been in the middle of troubleshooting a minor technical issue with the application when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. "Is this Mark Petrov?" the voice on the other end had asked. "This is Jennifer Walsh from Sterling Industries. Mr. Sterling would like to schedule a meeting to discuss your investment application." Mark had assumed it was some kind of user support request and had begun explaining how to navigate the application's investment features. It had taken several minutes of confused conversation before he understood that Robert Sterling, the billionaire, wanted to meet with him about potentially investing in his company. The meeting had been scheduled for the following week at Sterling Industries headquarters, a gleaming 40-story tower in the financial district that Mark had only seen from the outside during job fair recruiting events. As he prepared for what would undoubtedly be the most important business meeting of his life, Mark couldn't help but think about Professor Blackwood's dismissive comments about immigrant entrepreneurs who didn't understand American business culture. In less than 6 months, he had gone from being publicly humiliated in an academic setting to being courted by one of the most successful investors in the country. The irony was delicious, but more importantly, it was validation that his understanding of the problems facing immigrant and low-income communities had been exactly what the market needed. The night before his meeting with Sterling, Mark had stayed up late reviewing his user data, financial projections, and expansion plans. But he had also spent time reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. The humiliation in Professor Blackwood's classroom had been devastating, but it had also been the catalyst that pushed him to stop seeking permission and start building solutions. As he finally fell asleep in the early hours of the morning, Mark was already imagining the conversation he would eventually have with Professor Blackwood. He was going to prove her wrong in the most spectacular way possible, and he was going to do it with the kind of grace and professionalism that would make the contrast between their approaches unmistakable. The revenge was going to be sweet, but it was also going to be educational. The Sterling Industries boardroom occupied the entire 42nd floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city that had once seemed so intimidating to a young immigrant student. Now, 6 months after Professor Blackwood's humiliating dismissal, Mark Petrov sat at a polished mahogany table worth more than his family's annual income, watching Robert Sterling review the acquisition documents that would change everything. Sterling was not what Mark had expected from a billionaire. At 45, the South African-born entrepreneur carried himself with quiet confidence rather than flashy ostentation. His office was filled with books on technology and economic development rather than expensive art, and he spoke with the measured precision of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. "Your user engagement numbers are remarkable," Sterling said, looking up from the financial projections spread across the table. 73% active monthly users for a financial application is unprecedented. Most fintech startups struggle to maintain 40% engagement after the first quarter. Mark had prepared extensively for this meeting, but he still felt surreal sitting across from one of the most successful investors in the country. The journey from Professor Blackwood's classroom to this boardroom felt like something that had happened to someone else entirely. "The engagement is high because we're solving real problems for people who have been ignored by traditional financial services," Mark explained. "When you design something specifically for communities that have been underserved, and you actually understand those communities because you're part of them, the product-market fit is much stronger." Sterling smiled, recognizing something familiar in Mark's words. "I've heard that argument before, usually from entrepreneurs who have been told their ideas won't work in American markets. How many investors told you that your approach was too niche or too risky?" 12. Mark replied without hesitation. 12 different firms told me that low-income families weren't a viable market for investment products. They suggested I pivot to serving middle-class millennials or college students with disposable income from their parents. "And how much revenue did those supposedly non-viable customers generate for you last month?" Mark consulted his laptop, though he knew the numbers by heart. $237,000 in transaction fees, with a 78% month-over-month growth rate. "Our customer acquisition cost is 63% lower than industry average because we're getting organic referrals through community organizations and word of mouth." Sterling nodded approvingly. "Those are the kinds of numbers that separate real businesses from venture capital fantasies. You're not just building a product. You're building a sustainable enterprise that generates genuine value for both users and investors." The conversation continued for another hour, covering technical architecture, regulatory compliance, expansion plans, and competitive analysis. Sterling asked detailed questions that demonstrated he had thoroughly researched not just Mark's application, but the broader fintech landscape and the specific challenges facing immigrant entrepreneurs. As the meeting progressed, Mark realized that Sterling wasn't just evaluating a potential investment opportunity. He was identifying with a story that paralleled his own experience as an immigrant entrepreneur who had been dismissed by established industry players. 20 years ago, Sterling said during a pause in their discussion, "I pitched my first startup to 16 different venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. 15 of them told me that I didn't understand American technology markets well enough to succeed. They suggested I find an American co-founder to serve as CEO while I handled technical development." Mark leaned forward, recognizing the familiar sting of being told that his background was a liability rather than an asset. "The 16th firm offered to invest," Sterling continued, "but only if I agreed to move to a purely technical role and let them bring in experienced American management. I turned them down and bootstrapped the company with personal savings and small business loans. That company eventually sold for $400 million. The parallels were unmistakable, and Mark understood that this meeting was about more than just financial projections and market analysis. Sterling was investing in something deeper. The principle that immigrant entrepreneurs who understood underserved communities could build businesses that established industry players couldn't or wouldn't create. "I want to make you an offer," Sterling said, sliding a document across the table. "Sterling Industries will acquire your application and its underlying technology for $50 million. Additionally, I want to offer you a position as the youngest member of Sterling Industries' board of directors, with responsibility for overseeing our investments in fintech and community development initiatives. Mark stared at the document, processing numbers that seemed impossible just months after being told his ideas were unrealistic. $50 million was more money than he had ever imagined, but the board position was even more significant. It represented validation not just of his business model, but of his perspective and expertise. "There's one more thing," Sterling added with a slight smile. "I want you to know that I've been following the media coverage of your story. The articles about the professor who dismissed your idea and the success you've achieved afterward. I find that narrative particularly compelling because I've lived it myself." Mark felt a surge of satisfaction thinking about Professor Blackwood reading those same articles. The local newspaper coverage had been picked up by national business publications, and his story had become a case study in entrepreneurial resilience and the importance of understanding your target market. "Academic experts told me my ideas wouldn't work in American markets," Sterling continued. "They said I didn't understand American business culture well enough to succeed. I've spent 20 years proving them wrong, and I've made it a priority to invest in entrepreneurs who are facing similar dismissals." 3 days later, Mark walked across the campus of Riverside University for what he intended to be the last time as a student. The acquisition paperwork had been completed, the funds had been transferred, and his transformation from dismissed student to successful entrepreneur was now a matter of public record. But he wasn't walking across campus to clean out his locker or say goodbye to friends. He was walking to Professor Blackwood's office to have a conversation that had been months in the making. The business building looked smaller than he remembered, and the hallways that had once seemed intimidating now felt almost quaint. Students hurried past with backpacks and coffee cups, focused on assignments and exams that felt like artifacts from a previous life. Professor Blackwood's office was on the 3rd floor, down a hallway lined with faculty achievements and departmental announcements. Mark knocked on her door at exactly 2 o'clock, the time they had agreed upon when he had called to request a meeting. "Come in," came the familiar voice that had once had the power to devastate his confidence. Professor Blackwood looked up from her computer as Mark entered, and her expression immediately shifted from polite professionalism to barely concealed discomfort. She had obviously read the media coverage of his success, and she clearly understood why he had requested this meeting. "Mr. Petrov," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "Congratulations on your recent business success. I've been following the news coverage with great interest." Mark sat down, noting how different the power dynamic felt compared to their previous interactions. Professor Blackwood was no longer the intimidating authority figure who could crush dreams with casual comments. She was simply another person who had been wrong about something important. "Thank you, Professor," Mark replied politely. "I wanted to meet with you to discuss some of the feedback you provided on my original presentation and how it influenced the development of my business." Professor Blackwood shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She had spent months hoping this conversation would never happen, but Mark's success had made it inevitable. "I'm sure you understand that academic critique is intended to challenge students to think more rigorously about their assumptions," she began, adopting the defensive tone of someone trying to rationalize past behavior. "My comments were designed to help you consider potential weaknesses in your business model." Mark nodded thoughtfully. "I do understand that constructive criticism is valuable. What I found interesting, though, was that many of your specific critiques turned out to be incorrect. For example, you argued that low-income families don't have disposable income to invest. My user data shows that my customers have invested over $4 million in the past 6 months." The specific numbers hung in the air like an indictment. Professor Blackwood had not just been wrong in principle. She had been wrong about measurable, quantifiable facts that could be verified through real-world data. "You also suggested that my understanding of American markets was limited by my immigrant background," Mark continued, his voice remaining calm and professional. "But it turned out that my understanding of immigrant and low-income communities was exactly what made the business successful. Sterling Industries specifically cited my market insight as a key factor in their investment decision." Professor Blackwood's face was flushing slightly, and she was clearly struggling to find a response that would allow her to maintain some dignity while acknowledging the magnitude of her error. "I'm pleased that your venture has been successful," she said finally. "Business education involves exposing students to rigorous critique, and sometimes that critique proves to be overly conservative. The important thing is that you persevered despite the challenges. Mark recognized the attempt to reframe her dismissive comments as somehow beneficial to his development, but he wasn't interested in allowing her to escape responsibility for her behavior. Actually, Professor, there's something else I wanted to discuss with you. Robert Sterling, the CEO of Sterling Industries, shared something interesting with me during our negotiations. He mentioned that he had previously submitted a consulting proposal to Riverside University's business school, offering to provide guest lectures and mentorship opportunities for students interested in entrepreneurship. Professor Blackwood's expression immediately changed, and Mark could see that she knew exactly where this conversation was heading. According to Mr. Sterling, his proposal was rejected by the faculty committee responsible for external partnerships. He mentioned that the committee felt his background and approach weren't aligned with the school's academic standards. The irony was devastating. Professor Blackwood had not only dismissed Mark's business idea, but she had also been part of the committee that had rejected collaboration with the very investor who would later validate Mark's approach and provide him with a $50 million exit. University partnerships require careful consideration of multiple factors, Professor Blackwood began, but Mark interrupted her gently. I'm not here to criticize your committee's decision-making process, he said. I'm here because I wanted to understand something. When you dismissed my presentation and made comments about my immigrant background and my understanding of American business culture, were you speaking from expertise or were you speaking from bias? The question was direct and unavoidable. Professor Blackwood had spent her career hiding behind academic authority and institutional prestige, but now she was being confronted by someone who had achieved measurable success in the real world she claimed to understand. Mr. Petrov, I think you're mischaracterizing our previous interactions, she said, attempting to maintain her professional composure. Academic critique can sometimes seem harsh, but it's intended to prepare students for real-world challenges. Mark pulled out his phone and showed her a screenshot of his application's current user statistics. Professor, I have 47,000 active users who have invested over $4 million through my platform. I have a successful exit to one of the largest investment firms in the country. I have been featured in national business publications as an example of innovative fintech entrepreneurship. These are measurable, objective indicators of business success. He paused, letting the weight of those achievements settle in the room. Given these results, do you think your original critique was accurate? Do you think I misunderstood American business culture? Do you think my idea was unrealistic immigrant thinking? Professor Blackwood was silent for a long moment, clearly struggling with a situation she had never anticipated. She had spent years delivering harsh judgments to students, secure in the belief that her academic position gave her the authority to determine who would succeed and who would fail in the business world. Now she was facing concrete evidence that her judgment had been not just wrong, but spectacularly wrong. More importantly, she was facing that evidence from someone she had personally dismissed and humiliated. I may have been overly critical in my assessment, she said finally, the words clearly difficult for her to speak. Your success suggests that there were aspects of the market opportunity that I didn't fully appreciate. Mark nodded, accepting her partial acknowledgement while recognizing that it fell far short of a genuine apology for her behavior. There's one more thing I wanted to share with you, he said, pulling out a business card. Robert Sterling has asked me to help identify promising student entrepreneurs who might benefit from mentorship and investment opportunities. He's particularly interested in students from immigrant backgrounds who are working on solutions for underserved communities. He placed the card on her desk, a small gesture that carried enormous symbolic weight. If you have students working on projects that traditional investors might dismiss as unrealistic, I'd be happy to evaluate their potential. Sometimes the best business opportunities come from people who understand problems that others have overlooked. Professor Blackwood stared at the business card, recognizing it as both a generous offer and a subtle reminder of how completely their positions had reversed. I appreciate the offer, she said quietly. Mark stood up, preparing to leave her office for what he knew would be the last time. As he reached for the door handle, he turned back for one final comment. Professor, I hope you'll consider sharing my story with your future students. Not as an example of someone who succeeded despite academic criticism, but as an example of why it's important to listen carefully to people who understand the communities they're trying to serve. Sometimes the best business insights come from the most unexpected sources. As Mark left the building and walked across campus toward his car, he felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with validation. He had proven that Professor Blackwood's dismissive judgment had been wrong, but more importantly, he had proven that immigrant entrepreneurs who understood underserved communities could build businesses that created genuine value for both users and investors. The $50 million acquisition was certainly satisfying, but the real victory was the 47,000 families who were now building wealth through his application. Those families represented the validation that mattered most, proof that his understanding of their needs and challenges had been exactly right. 3 weeks later, Mark received an email that brought the story full circle. Professor Blackwood had recommended one of her current students for evaluation by Sterling Industries' entrepreneurship program. The student was a young woman from Guatemala who had developed a business plan for a microlending platform designed specifically for immigrant small business owners. Mark smiled as he read the email, recognizing the irony and the progress it represented. Professor Blackwood had learned something from their encounter, and she was now using her position to support exactly the kind of student she had previously dismissed. Sometimes the best revenge was simply being right, and letting that rightness speak for itself through measurable success and positive impact. Mark had proven his point in the most definitive way possible, by building something that worked, scaling it successfully, and creating value for everyone involved. The humiliation in Classroom 304 had been the catalyst, but the real story was what came after. Mark had transformed rejection into motivation, criticism into fuel, and dismissal into determination. He had built something remarkable, and in doing so, he had forced everyone who had doubted him to reconsider their assumptions about immigrant entrepreneurs and underserved markets. The business was successful, the exit was lucrative, and the impact was meaningful. But the most satisfying part was knowing that Professor Blackwood would never again dismiss a student's idea without remembering the one who proved her completely wrong.